So today we're going to talk about story structure. Maybe you're thinking, story structure, that only limits my creativity, blah, I don't want to. Keep watching because I'm going to give you some arguments why story structure is actually really great for keeping your story on track, being economical, and how it can help you write faster and more solid stories. Welcome back to Pencils and Stories. My name is Henrike and I make comics. I also teach comics. If you like to make comics as well, subscribe below and hit that bell button to not miss any videos. You probably consumed thousands of stories in your life, either through media or even in your own life when you're talking to somebody and you hear somebody else's story. So most people naturally have a certain idea of how to structure a story. Story has a beginning, middle, ending. But if you want to make a longer story, a lot of people get hung up, they get stuck, they have plot holes, they have story problems. I recognize that as well. I have been stuck in stories before, and some stories are salvageable, some are not, but I believe that if you use story structure, then the chances of you getting so stuck that you cannot go on are actually very limited. I love story structure. I love analyzing movies I just saw in cinema in my head for days later. It's kind of like a thing that I love doing. I would love to talk to you about story structure and share with you my favorite structures that I use to come up with my stories. So today is all about structuring your story. I know there's a lot of different opinions. Some artists like to make up the story as they go. Others write everything out beforehand. It's all up to you. However, I am very much in favor of writing a story in a structure because otherwise you run the chance of going on these fun little sidelines and have all these side stories and all of that stuff. And having a structure, having one clear kind of like goal that you're trying to bring your story towards really helps you keep focused and keep focused on the stuff that matters. A good example of this is I heard a story about the Lord of the Rings, and as you know, the Lord of the Rings is like this giant epic story, and Peter Jackson and his crew are really struggling with his writers to keep the story kind of compact because they needed to tell it in 3 movies. And what they kept coming back to was the fact that Frodo is in fact the main protagonist of the story. So whenever they would be like, well, do we need to put this in? They always ask themselves, is this relevant to the story of Frodo? If it's not, we're gonna cut it. And if you can figure that out for your story, who is it about, and you structure it in a meaningful way and you kind of build it up, then I think your story is gonna get real strong. I know that some writers kind of have a little aversion against structure because they feel that it is limiting their creativity, and I actually don't agree, because if you can do anything, the chances of your story like exploding and then you having to cut down a lot afterwards is really big. Also, if you have a clear, precise point, I don't see how you cannot be as creative as possible with that one idea. I actually think that creativity thrives within constraints. So that's why I'm really in favor of story structure, and especially for a longer comic project, it just keeps you on track. So then the logical question obviously is, what story structure do I use? Because there's a lot of them out there. I don't think that one is better than the other. There's some that are clearer to me, but I'm actually encouraging you, like, look into it, look at all the different kinds of story structures there are and try and figure out which one works for you. I know, for example, a lot of people use the structure called the hero's journey. It is this kind of like cycle that your main character kind of goes through, and it is set up in a way that it sounds like a fantasy epic, which is, I think, why it doesn't necessarily work as well for me, because I find the hero's journey very confusing. I've tried to use it a few times, but it's just the steps are not too clear to me what they can mean because they are phrased in such a specific way. So that's why I don't use it, but I know that it works for a lot of other people. Me personally, I use a combination of the story spine from Brian McDonald's book Invisible Ink and the Save the Cat story beat sheet. Save the Cat's a book created by Blake Snyder, and it's very filmic, and I think that fits the way that I have been raised on story, because I watched a ton of animated movies especially, but a lot of Hollywood movies, a lot of TV series that are, I think, pretty much based on Hollywood, and that story structure really fits into that category. I think the book itself is a little rigid in that it says this has to happen on that page and then that needs to happen in a certain amount, so it's very rigid. But just, I take all of that with a grain of salt and I just look at the beat sheet, which is like, it feels natural to me. And then the story spine from Brian McDonald is a very helpful framework to kind of capture a story in 7 lines. And you might actually know this one because it is kind of coined by Pixar. You had this Pixar's rules of storytelling thing going around a while back, and the story spine is actually in there. It's just not something that's made up by Pixar. It was something that was taught by Brian McDonald at Pixar, or a lot of those people read the book. But the story spine is in fact something that comes from Invisible Ink, a book which I highly recommend, by the way. And Brian argues that every single story is made up of these lines. Every single story fits into those lines. And it also really shows the basic structure of story. That's also the core power of the book, Invisible Ink, is it really tries to get down on what is story, how is it used. I believe the most simple way to explain what a story is you have a main character, they really want something. And that's kind of like that drive through the story. And then they face obstacles towards their goal, and that is the plot. And then in the end, they either get what they want or they don't get it. Oftentimes, the character figures out that they actually don't want it anymore, or they want something else, or they need something else. So that's the most simple way that I know of to explain what story is. I think one of the most fun things in a story is that your character goes from a point A to a point B, and they change over the course of the story. And then for story structure, it's still one of the easiest ways I know to start the story, which is the story spine of Brian McDonald, which I talked about. I recommend you read the book in order to fully understand it, and then practice on a lot of stories. Practice on comics, books, films, like practice. And eventually you'll start to see in stories and in movies. One of my favorite pastimes is thinking about a story that I just saw, read, whatever, and just think about it and figure out how the story is structured. I also like to use Blake Snyder's beat sheet, and I will link to it in the description below. I also recommend that book because it kind of helps you have a deeper framework still of like, I usually start with a story spine, and then I will kind of crystallize it out, like branch out using that. There's all kinds of story structures that you can use. Hero's Journey, there's the snowflake method, there's people who just focus on acts and scenes and have a structure kind of surrounding that. But there's very different ways of doing it. I know that in the West we often use the 3-act structure. I know in some other countries in the East, they have the 4-act story structure. I've heard that they use that a lot in Japan. So there's all kinds of ways that you can structure your story, and it really helps to be able to have this framework where you can put all of those story beats and story and plot points and characters and kind of have it neatly structured so your story makes the most sense to your audience. And you don't go to any weird sidelines, which is totally fine for like a Patreon or a small side book with your Kickstarter. Just totally do that if you want that. But for your main story, especially if you want to be concise and you want to be done with your comic at a certain point, I really recommend having this basic structure and then knowing where you're gonna end up, because that really helps. So now you heard about my favorite story structures. I would love to hear if you use any other structures, maybe some that I don't know about. Please share them in the comments below. Share your experiences with story structure, structuring stories, and writing stories. I would love to hear about it. Like I mentioned in the video, I share a few of my favorite books about writing and storytelling and some resources that I know about in the description below. So please go there and check out all of those websites and books. And while you're there, also check out my email list. I often share extra insights that I got, new resources I find, and any extra tips and tricks, or even some little extras that you cannot get anywhere else. For now, I want to thank you so much for watching and see you next week.